Very much for joining me for our weekly COVID briefing. I'm joined today by our Secretary of State, Maggie Toulouse-Oliver, and she's going to give us a voting update and will be available to answer questions about voting COVID safe practices. So we'll get to the Secretary of State in a moment, as always. I want to thank the person who made this incredible mask. It's reversible. It's made by Annette Ariano from Arroyo Hondo. So Annette, thank you for your kindness and thank you very much for your talent. I'm very grateful. I'm going to take my mask off so that I can be heard clearly. And again, for folks who are watching for the first time, as each of the speakers, there's only two of us today, we will keep our masks on during the other person's presentation and then take them off so that you can hear us clearly. So let's go to our case update. Today we have 239 new cases. That brings us to just frankly under 30,000, 28,224. We have 66 hospitalizations, 16 of those on ventilators. As we talk about in our hospital capacity, those numbers are holding. That's good, but remember that will shift the longer we have higher case counts. Unfortunately, we are announcing 2 additional deaths today. That brings us to 859, and as always, every New Mexican is mourning these losses, and our condolences to the families, loved ones, and neighbors, and losses in these communities. To date, we have done 885,373 tests conducted statewide, and we've got a slide that I'll get to later on that will really talk about where we can do a bit better in terms of testing. We have capacity, so let's get more tests done. And I also want to point out that today you'll notice that we don't have Dr. Grace. He did his briefing earlier in the week, and now that they're working on vaccine implementation strategies and scenarios, we weren't able to get our calendars to sync up for 2 COVID updates in the same week. So let's go to my first slide. So I'm going to be doing some of the work that Dr. Grace typically does for us. For those of you who watch routinely, you'll recognize it as our statewide public health gating criteria. We use these different categories to determine whether or not we are safely opening or managing current activities, because we know that human-to-human contact is how the COVID transmissions occur. So our job is to analyze that information and to give you a sense about where we are. Red means that we're not on target. So you'll notice that the first is how we measure the spread of COVID-19. Our gating target is just over 1. 1.05 or less. We've been tracking at less. We are now just above at 1.09, ending the week of September 22nd. We are, however, holding on our rolling 7-day average. We can't be above 168 cases. We're well below at 110, so that's very good news, but that will be impacted if we don't get our rate of infection back down. Number of tests per day. We want to do 5,000. Now this slide says that we're above that target, but really I'm trying to get us to 7,000, so we've got that in the red. Everything else is green. Let's talk about that. The next category is the positivity rates. I'm going to talk about that in another slide. We have to be at 5% or less. Ending last week, our 7-day average was 2.13. That's very good. I'm going to give you some not so great news in another slide, but the gating criteria is still looking really good. Our contact tracing, which is when we tell you right after a test whether or not you're positive, and all of your contacts, we have a 24-hour turnaround for the infected person and 36, no more than that, to getting to your contacts. You can see that we're well below 19 hours, week ending 9/18, and 25 hours for contacts, week ending 9/18. And again, our hospital capacity, which is really the critical test. Now again, we don't want anyone infected. We're seeing chronic diseases and chronic conditions as a result. We're still getting information. This is a new virus. We don't know enough about it, but it is concerning. Nobody wants COVID-19, even if you're asymptomatic for the entire time or you have minimal light symptoms. It is dangerous, people die, and we're seeing incredible issues. So we don't want that, but a very important part of the gating criteria is making sure that we don't overwhelm our healthcare system, because we need a healthcare system that deals with every issue, cardiac arrest, and being able to treat COVID-19. You can see that we're well below our gating criteria, both for the number of hospital beds and critical care beds that we need. So we have 439. End of the week, we had 252 occupied, and we're still on track to have at least a 7-day supply of personal protective equipment. So overall, gating criteria is still looking really good. Pay attention, I am, to the rate of infection, and we're going to talk about testing in a moment. Next slide. All right, so what that shows is that we're still doing good work in New Mexico, but what it also indicates is we've introduced risk. We're seeing the results of that, and the nation is still in this fight. We are still seeing incredible transmission and rates of infection and spread in the United States. This week, we reached 200,000 COVID-19 deaths. It's an unfathomable tragedy, and frankly, we're not done, unfortunately. It is not going to disappear. And as we move, because of the weather, into more indoor environments, we're going to see that we have additional risk, and we need to deal with that. And I want to, I was starting to read the quote, and I digressed a bit, but the quote about the virus is not going to disappear is right from Dr. Fauci in an address to the Navajo Nation this week. And he's really telling us, be careful about these challenges, being indoors, you're ripe for a surge. And so I want to really point that out. The public health experts have been warning us, and that warning is still very much the standard course for all of the experts in the nation. We've been alerting you that the winter, so I'll just say it one more time, we're entering a new phase for COVID-19. So I need folks to double down on your good COVID-safe practices. If we don't do that, then we'll have uncontrollable spread, and that's exactly what we must avoid. Good news is you already know. New Mexicans, by and large, know that what the game plan is. So wear your mask, keep your physical distance, avoid indoor exposure with others. Please get a test if you think you have any symptoms, even if they're not the core CDC symptoms or the symptoms, that we're putting out: fever, cough, shortness of breath, gastrointestinal issues, headaches. If you think you aren't feeling well, something's just not right, get a COVID test. Let's just rule that out. Because if you do have COVID, we can give you sound medical advice and support and isolate you so we're not spreading COVID. And if we do those things, we can crush COVID's ability to keep spreading. It needs hosts. The way that it identifies hosts is folks too close together, not following COVID-safe practices. Next slide. All right, I want to show you the other data points that we use. Frankly, I look at them every day to tell us what's going on in the state. You can see that we were coming down. So let's go to the middle of this chart. You can see in August 24th, 30th that we were still seeing, we came down from our highest week of August 10th for rapid responses. Remember, this is when the state, through the Environment Department and other stakeholders, goes out and has to support a business entity, private sector, sometimes public sector. Frankly, I always do that. It's any organization, any business that has a positive COVID case. We go in, determine whether or not we have to shut down for 24 hours, do incredible cleaning and sterilization to the highest degree possible, get everyone tested and come back, or with some hybrid. Some employees are isolated, tested, and quarantined, and some others that we rule out because they got a COVID test can still manage to come to work safely. All right, so what we're looking for is these incredible downward trends. Now look, right after Labor Day, we're seeing incredible successes. September 7th through the 13th, you know, we're just above 100 rapid responses in a week. Now look where we are last week. September 14th to the 20th, we're well over 200. This is problematic. This is an indication that we're spreading COVID, and we're spreading it right back to some of our higher risk areas, including restaurants. Are restaurants the problem? I want to talk about this again. No business, including restaurants, in and of themselves are COVID-19 problems. It's workers who are exposed somewhere else, workers who can be exposed by patrons, having too much of the virus available, positivity rates in our communities creates these kinds of risks. This is a poor indicator about where we're headed. And I want every New Mexican to see this. We have to do better, because what happens if we don't? More people die, more people get sick. We have significant education risks. Next slide. All right, so let's talk about some data points inside where I showed you the growth rates in that chart. So last week, we saw 100 more rapid responses, 100 more than the week before. Here's where we're seeing the biggest increases. Bernalillo County, 250% increase. Sandoval County, 133% increase. Doña Ana County, 100% increase. These are indicators that we are headed in the wrong direction. I'm going to say that one more time. These are poor indicators, and we have the power ourselves to change that trajectory as quickly as possible. And I also want to tell you, I want to shout out to the business sector. Lots of our business partners are working diligently to remind people to keep their masks on while they're waiting in line, to remind them to keep 6 feet apart while they're inside grocery shopping. And it's tough, and they're reporting to us that more and more New Mexico patrons and maybe some visitors from out of state, you know, really aren't interested in getting that reminder. Please help your businesses and your New Mexico small businesses in particular. They need your help to make sure that we're as COVID safe as possible. Rapid responses at restaurants up from 7 to 24, more than a 3-fold increase. Rapid responses at retail and wholesale locations up from 19 to 40. Am I asking people to panic? Absolutely not. No matter what's going on in a public health emergency, that's an irresponsible response. I just want us to pay attention, and we can and must do better. Next slide. Good news. We are seeing a successful re-entry into public schools. We've been doing that since the day after Labor Day, so September 7th. So here's what we know. We've got 65 schools operating in the hybrid model. That means half the class is there Monday, Tuesdays, closed for cleaning on Wednesdays. The other half of the class there Thursday, Friday. Everybody else distance learning in that hybrid model. Every other school that can't do that, these are elementary schools, still doing distance learning. Remember that we allowed this. Many school districts voted to suspend all the way through this first semester. Since September 7th, we have 71 positive COVID cases in students and staff. Interestingly enough, it's about half and half. 34 students, 37 staff. 55% of the total cases were students or staff engaged in remote learning. That means that it's not happening because kiddos and educators are coming back to school. Good news. However, this is again, if we're seeing increases in COVID cases, last couple of days are not good indicators, right? We're seeing a doubling from about 100 cases to 200, and today 239. That's a troubling couple of days. It means that you have folks who, if they were in the classroom, would have likely exposed others in the classroom. It's exactly what we are concerned about, and it's what we must do better at. So again, New Mexico, this is certainly better successful reentry than many states in the country. We learned from their mistakes. I want to thank our public education and private education partners who are doing everything in their power to have safe learning environments. But we are trending in the wrong direction as a state, so let's do better. We are going to continue our very strict COVID safe practices in schools, which, as you know, includes mask wearing. Okay, next slide. All right, so here's the issue I wanted to talk to New Mexicans about. You saw that in the gating criteria, you know, we want to do better. The problem here is that we are seeing not enough New Mexicans come to get tested. And I want to maybe be helpful in this context. The CDC, other states, a lot of the national media, it can be very confusing. Do we have enough supplies in the supply chain? Can anyone get tested? Am I going to be charged for testing? And there's such inconsistent national information. I just want to talk about what New Mexico is doing. We are diligently chasing supplies, and while it's every week is a challenge, we have sufficient supplies to do 7,000, 7,500 tests a week, most weeks. We aren't getting those tests out, and in fact, yesterday we were just under 7,000 tests. I need New Mexicans who are willing to be tested. Who should be the priorities? Again, no wrong door. Everyone can get tested. Priority number one, any symptoms, particularly those associated with COVID-19. I need you to get tested. If you believe you've been exposed to COVID, I need you to get tested. If you think you've had to be out more than you typically do for any number of reasons, get tested. We need New Mexicans to get tested, and here's the other. If you're living in communities, and we are really pushing out in counties where the positivity rate is above 5, so southeastern New Mexico, as an example, not picking on anyone, we're all in it together, New Mexico, we must reduce our positivity rates, then we're going to push out more testing. Where we've done that, Carlsbad, for example, we only had a handful of folks come to one of our public health testing sites. We must have more people showing up, and we're going to keep increasing testing opportunities in those higher positivity rates counties. Remember, getting tested keeps you in your community safe, and it allows us to isolate COVID, which means we bring down the rate of transmission and those positivity rates. Really critical for schools, kiddos, and our families. Next slide. All right, so we are expanding child care access. This is really critical because, in fact, and we know that we're introducing a little risk as we have folks go back to work. We know that we're increasing risk. We want to make sure it's managed, productive, prudent, smart risk where we can crush the cases again. But as we're doing that, we know that our workers, those families, need more help for child care. So if you're searching for a job, if you're teleworking and your teleworking company is getting concerned about your ability to do that successfully, if you're studying online, if you're enrolled in a graduate or postgraduate program, all of these folks now qualify for child care assistance. You didn't before. It is based on income, so what we're looking for is to do enough to make sure that it's either waived or you're paying a very small copay. Income eligibility is up to 200% of the federal poverty level, so it's $52,400 for a family of 4. And again, with all of our challenges, I'd love to have better federal opportunities here, but we're going to keep working to provide more child care access to more New Mexico families. Here's how you enroll. You go to nmeced.org. That stands for our Early Childhood Education Department. nmeced.org. Click Am I Eligible? Or you can call us at 800-691 9067, and I'm going to take a quick opportunity, and I'm almost done. We received a really incredibly nice note from a graduate student in the state of New Mexico. And I just want folks to know that your messages are received, and we appreciate being able to share with everyone in New Mexico when things work and also when we're challenged so that we can do something about it. Someone wrote to us the following: I have 2 little boys who have been at home since February. Trying to balance class and children has been a struggle and has already caused us to miss classes and other events. Childcare is very expensive. Being in graduate school, I'm not permitted to work more than 15 hours per week, and my husband was furloughed from his restaurant job due to COVID-19. I know this amendment, change to childcare, I added that, will help so many families like us out there who are working to give their kids a better life. I'm so grateful for our hardworking government and for the amazing women at the graduate school that this student is from. I'm going to not tell you who that is. I'm working hard to make sure that these are anonymous, who made this happen. And I think the point that this incredible New Mexican makes is it does make a difference. Everybody needs just a little bit extra support, and that students are frankly helping New Mexico state government figure out vehicles and mechanisms to do better by our New Mexico families. We are encouraged by everyone's suggestion how to make our program stretch just a little further. And to the mom who wrote this, thank you very much for working hard, because what you did and what your graduate students did didn't just help your family, it helped many New Mexico families. We really are all in this together. And thank you, New Mexico. I really appreciated this note. All right, with that, I believe we are finally at our voting update. And with that, Madam Secretary of State, you're on. Thank you for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Madam Governor, for having me. Thanks to all of you for being here today for a quick update on the 2020 general election, which as we speak is a mere 40 days away, which sometimes feels like too much time and most of the time feels like not enough time. The 2020 general election, as I mentioned, is right around the corner. And election administrators all across the state are working diligently every day to ensure voters have everything they need to make their voices heard at the ballot box. This election is happening in a highly polarized political environment during a global pandemic, but voters should rest assured that you will be able to cast your ballot safely and securely, no matter where you live in New Mexico or which method you use. We are already seeing great enthusiasm among New Mexico voters, and for me, that makes me extremely happy and gratified. Statewide voter registration surged past 1.3 million voters in August, and as of today, we've had 247,725 New Mexicans already apply for their absentee ballot. There's a lot to get to. I'm going to use my time with you here today to discuss the most important things voters should know as you prepare to vote in the upcoming election, and then, of course, leave time for any questions at the end. So, pertaining to this first slide that you see here, these are some of the most important deadlines to keep in mind over the next few weeks. The first and most important thing to do is the first step in the voting process, and that is to register to vote or update your voter registration. I also want to encourage all New Mexico voters, just check your voter registration. Make sure it's correct. Make sure your address is current. Often we move around and forget to update our address, maybe forget to change our name. Whatever it is that you need to do, make sure that it is correct and update your voter registration as necessary. We make it very easy for you at nmvote.org. That's nmvote.org. If you have a current or expired New Mexico state ID or driver's license, you can register and update your voter registration online. Or, of course, call your county clerk and ask for a voter registration form to be mailed to you. You can find a ton of other resources at nmvote.org as well that I will be going over in the next slides. But keep these dates in mind as you make a plan to vote. Moving on to the next slide. So I really want to stress the importance of not only registering to vote, but checking to make sure your voter registration is up to date. This is particularly important for this election where we expect many people to utilize an absentee ballot. So you need to make sure your address and other information is correct to ensure there is no delay in receiving your ballot. Online voter registration is going to end on October 6th, but a reminder that you will be eligible to vote in a limited fashion on the same day, to register and vote on the same day. That will be available throughout the state and at every county clerk's office. So again, being registered to vote is the first step to making your voice heard. So make sure you get registered or check your registration ASAP, and then encourage everyone you know to do the same. The next slide is about absentee ballots. We are getting a lot of questions now about absentee ballots, as many New Mexicans want to vote by mail while we're still in the midst of a pandemic. It is undoubtedly the most convenient and safest way to cast your ballot. So first of all, any registered voter in New Mexico can vote by absentee ballot. And in-person voting is safe and will be safe here. It will be available in all 33 counties, but there are some important things for voters to know if you're going to vote by mail. First, you may have already applied for your absentee ballot. Obviously, about 275,000 of you already have, either using our online system or with a paper form mailed to your county clerk. And you may be wondering why you haven't gotten your ballot yet. And this is because county clerks cannot begin sending those ballots to voters until October 6th. That's when they're going to go out in the mail, and starting tomorrow, county clerks around the state are going to start prepping those ballots, getting them ready to be mailed out to you starting on the 6th. So please keep that in mind. October 20th, which seems like a long way away right now, but it's really not, is the last day that voters can apply for an absentee ballot. So I would just encourage you to get that application in as soon as you possibly can. If you want to mail your completed ballot back, you should do so no later than October 27th, because that is what the U.S. Postal Service tells us it needs, a full 7 days before Election Day, to ensure that your ballot gets back to your county clerk by 7 p.m. on Election Day. That is the deadline for a county clerk to receive a ballot here in New Mexico. Voters should also know that you can drop your absentee ballot off at any polling location in your county. So if you forget to mail it, if something comes up and you're within a week to Election Day, or at any point that there is an open polling place, you can drop your ballot with that poll official if that is what you feel comfortable doing. The point is, voters, whether you vote in person or by mail, have a variety of options at your disposal in terms of how to cast your ballot. Our next slide is going to talk about in-person voting. So, of course, in-person voting is absolutely an option here in New Mexico. And as I mentioned before, it will be available to voters in every county, and you should feel safe if you do choose to vote in person. All polling places will follow public health guidelines, and poll officials will be continually wiping down surfaces, enforcing social distancing, just engaging in all of those COVID-safe practices at the polls. If you plan to vote in person, I would suggest taking some time to download and fill out your sample ballot before you go to the polls, just so you already have in mind what's going to be on your ballot, and if there are any candidates or races that you want to do a little research about beforehand, you get the time to do that. You can do that starting now at nmvote.org. Find your sample ballot there online. And this is a great way to save a little time at the polls, and I just highly encourage that. Remember, please, that the polls will be open on Election Day from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. and as long as you're in line before 7 p.m. on Election Day, you'll be able to vote. But what I really hope is that if you're going to vote in person, that you get out and vote early. We have such a multitude of options for early voting throughout the state, starting 3 Saturdays before Election Day. Find the time on a weekend or maybe in the middle of an afternoon when you need to get up from your telework environment and take a break and stretch your legs to go and vote when you're not in a long line at the last minute. The last slide, I'm just going to go over some important information that I just feel like everyone needs to know. I want to use this last bit of time to emphasize really some important points about the conduct of the election and about what the press and public should expect on election night and in the days after the election. Though we don't anticipate any delays in vote counting, there is a possibility that counting may have to continue after election night. And in fact, this is perfectly normal. It happens every single election. We've never conducted an election in New Mexico or in any other state where every single vote was tallied and counted on election night. And election night results are unofficial results for that reason. There is a multi-day process and multi-week process where county clerks and the Secretary of State's office go through and triple check to make sure that every single vote that should be counted and tallied is counted. So again, this is perfectly normal, and it is the statutory process that we go through here in New Mexico. Keep in mind that in addition to ballots that may come in to your county clerk on election day, county clerks must also review provisional ballots. They must count hand-tallied ballots. And bear in mind that in many cases, there may be an automatic recount that will go into effect for any race that's within a particularly close margin. So the counting continues for weeks, and as election administrators, we just feel lucky if we get Thanksgiving weekend off to be with our families. In New Mexico, because of the election bill that was passed during the June special legislative session, election workers are mandated to stop counting ballots at 11 p.m. on election night if they haven't finished. And this is really important because it's being implemented to prevent the fatigue of election workers. Fatigue leads to errors and mistakes, which leads to inaccuracies. And the most important thing that I and every county clerk in the state want to do is to give the voters of this state accurate election results. So if this were to happen in a county, the absentee ballot counting will continue the next morning, and then of course up until that process is complete. Also remember that all election results, again, as I said before, are always unofficial until canvassed officially by each county canvassing board, then canvassed by my office, and then certified by the state canvassing board multiple weeks after Election Day. In addition to these points about vote counting, I just want to remind the public that we have a number of policies and procedures in place in New Mexico that ensure the integrity of our elections, like the exclusive use of paper ballots everywhere in New Mexico, along with mandatory post-election audits. And what these tools serve to do is to make sure that we have gotten an accurate vote count, and that if any potential threat to our counting systems were actually to occur, that we can always go back to that paper record and audit those machine results to make sure that we have an accurate vote count. New Mexicans should be confident in their election administrators and our democratic process. We have multiple ways to cast a ballot here in New Mexico, and that can fit into anyone's schedule or circumstances or your personal preference. It's really up to you, the voter. I just want to encourage all eligible New Mexicans to make sure you're registered to vote and then make a plan for how you will vote, either by absentee ballot or in person during early voting or on Election Day. And if you have questions, reach out to trusted sources of election information like my office or your local county clerk. Please do not believe everything you see on social media. Always go straight to that trusted source. Again, your Secretary of State's office or your local county clerk for information about how, where, and when to cast your ballot. So thank you so much for your time today, and Madam Governor, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Madam Secretary of State, and I think it's, I want to close on your part of the presentation with, we have a lot to be proud of in the state of New Mexico and our safe, credible, proactive approach to voting outside of a pandemic, but clearly during this pandemic have been really remarkable, and it's taken policymakers statewide with the support of their county clerks and the Secretary of State to really put this together and get it right. And thank you very much, and thank you for keeping your poll workers safe, as well as making sure that if people choose to vote in person, that they're also as safe as we can make it. Remember that mask wearing is mandated, and really appreciate your support in doing that. We want to make sure that people's voices are heard, that their right to vote is protected, and that we can also manage through a pandemic at the same time. So thank you very much for your leadership. All right, with that, Nora, we are ready for questions.
Thank you, Governor. I will start with Jen Gould with the Santa Fe New Mexican. I'll just remind our reporters on here to please let me know if you have a question by clicking the little hand. Jens, you're unmuted. Go right ahead.
Thank you. Hi, Governor.
Hi, Jens.
I wanted to ask about the reports earlier this week from Workforce Solutions that the state's unemployment benefits trust fund had been depleted earlier this month, and that the department was using money in borrowed federal funds to pay out benefits. Could you talk a bit about what the state's plan is on that going forward, and how it can fill the gap, and if this unemployment continues for some time as is projected, what can the state do? Thank you.
Oh, thank you for the question. Two things. There are two sort of resource pots for unemployment benefits, state and federal. And you're correct, and it's accurate that we knew that we were going to deplete the available resources in the state fund because we have unprecedented across the country unemployment related to COVID. And so we asked for, which is not outside of the norm, don't want to do it unless you have to, but we have the ability to ask the feds to support us through a loan up to several $100 million potentially. We have that authorization as well, but have only needed just about over 30 million, as you know. Not that that's insignificant, but we are trending in the right direction. What does that mean? Well, it means that as folks now are exhausting their state benefits, they're now eligible for federal benefits. So we aren't going to see an increase, I don't believe, at this point in time. And as long as New Mexicans, needing the state sources, and as long as New Mexicans continue to help us manage and crush COVID, it means more people are in a position to return to work. It's premature to talk about exactly what the plan is going to be, right? We're still working with Congress on any number of fixes. Every state is, hoping our delegations are going to get to a place where they can talk about federal support. That's got to be in filling those holes and gaps in states' unemployment trust funds. You have those funds available, right? Because you don't know what those rates are going to be. You want to make sure that you've got benefits to provide. Assuming that that happens, then easy strategy. Apply the money that we get, we're all made whole, and basically it would be identified, federal government's made whole, we're made whole. If that doesn't occur, we're going to have to work with the legislature on a long-term plan, and I think the feds are going to be amenable, because it's happening all across the country, to a long-term plan. And so that's all I have at this point, because we won't know till we know. But I do appreciate the question, and I think New Mexicans need to understand that we're paying attention. We're going to preserve these benefits for individuals on unemployment, and I appreciate very much you asking the question. And I also appreciate that you're paying attention so that New Mexicans know they can count on their benefits each week. Thank you, Jens.
Thank you, Governor. Next, I'll go to Chris McKee with KRQE. Chris, you're unmuted. Go right ahead. Chris, do I have you there? All right, I'm going to come back to Chris. We'll go to Algernon DeMassa with the Las Cruces Sun News. Algernon, you are unmuted. Go right ahead.
Thank you. I wanted to visit the efforts by racinos, the casinos, the non-tribal casinos connected with horse racing, in their efforts to get some sort of a plan in place that would allow them to partially reopen under an approved plan that would be considered safe, and they've made some proposals. I'm wondering if a process is actively underway, making any progress towards allowing some of those operations to resume. Thank you.
Algernon, thank you for the question. I mean, really, you've described that process. We want to have a relationship with our partners, including Racinos, to identify COVID-safe practices. They all have. And frankly, a shout out to that industry in particular, including, which is different, gaming in sovereign nations. Everyone has been very, very engaged in talking about how you do it, what the COVID-safe practices are, what their cleaning strategies are, what their rapid response strategies are, any number of issues, and they frankly look really good and sound to us. That part, while I don't know that we've actually approved, I think we might have, but I want to be careful about that, their COVID-safe practices, those conversations and discussions are ongoing and I think have been very productive. The issue isn't whether or not we think that they have the ability to execute good COVID-safe practices. I think they do. The issue is, are we at a place in New Mexico to add that additional risk? And given the last couple of days, and just to give you a sense, the statewide positivity rate was 3.4 yesterday. We are not trending in the right direction. That's the bad news. Where is my optimism? Well, you know, we still think this is the uptick by changes we made to the public health order at the beginning of September and Labor Day. Now, my expectation is, you know, we'll see it come back down. That's what we need. If that's the case, and it's then you can, right, at that 5-week benchmark, we're not quite there, but close, then we can talk about what are the next set of openings. And we are clear that Racinos, particularly because of their COVID-safe practices, that they are certainly an area we are hopeful that we can get to, but premature to tell you that that's on the immediate horizon. And that's really the issue. I will tell you this. Given that you have tribal gaming, you know, that creates a real sense of urgency by everyone else, and I understand that, I do. And I also understand that we are getting, as a state, impatient, that we are ready. We've seen, as I, you know, and I predicted that. Look, we're going to do some youth sports. What happened? Youth contact sports that are not supposed to be occurring, more than 10 people practicing in many places in the state. Also occurred, and non-COVID safe practices in any number of environments seem to be on the rise over the last weekend and several days. And do I think people do that just out of spite or purposefulness? No. I think it's mistaken information about what they can do. It's real impatience, wanting to support our kids. Impatience is not a public health strategy. It is the opposite of a good public health strategy. And while I worry every day about the economy and every day about making sure that we can save lives, we want to do this slow enough and thoughtful enough and pragmatic enough that it holds. So I'm feeling still good and optimistic. I am, even though the last couple of days have sort of jarred me. And I want to thank the Racinos, particularly our partners down south. You should know that I believe they're doing an incredible job, but we're not quite there yet, but we're working diligently towards that end. Next question.
Thank you, Governor. Next, I'll go to Julia Goldberg with the Santa Fe Reporter. Julia, you are unmuted. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you, Governor. I had a question if you were able to provide any information about reporting today earlier that the federal government is planning to crack down on hospitals that are not reporting complete COVID-19 data each day into the federal data system, specifically, I guess, threatening federal Medicare funding. And my understanding is no state is in full compliance. I wondered if you could provide any information on New Mexico's status and any communication you've had on that issue. Thank you.
Sure. You know, I don't have a lot of information directly on that point today, and we might have to follow up with you. But basically, two things. One, I expect our hospitals and hospitals around the country to provide as much meaningful data about both COVID inpatient services and testing and COVID risks to everyone. So you got to provide that Medicare data, you got to provide Medicaid data to us, and it needs to be accurate and timely. The federal government has had very inconsistent and then, frankly, inappropriate data requests moving where data sets typically go, get analyzed and reviewed from one place to another, from CDC to HHS. They have a whole auditing data set that got scrutinized by every state, every private sector, hospital, small, rural, large, impossible, and they've backed away from that. I think this is an indication still that the federal government wants data that would present that there's a better federal strategy occurring, and there isn't. I think it's also that they're creating administrative burdens where they shouldn't. However, I don't know that New Mexico hospitals are out of compliance. I don't know that there's been any shift about where they are talking about those crackdowns, and I will make sure that our communications team gets right to you, and we'll go right to our hospital folks in state government and our private sector partners at the association and make sure that you get accurate, up-to-date information.
Thank you, Governor. I'm going to come back to Chris McKee with KRQE now. Chris, you're unmuted. Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Hopefully you guys can hear me now. Wanted to ask a question about contact sports. Of course, they're not allowed right now. We've seen that continued over the last few months. I'm wondering if there are any considerations on maybe easing some of the restrictions for conditioning practicing for those teams, specifically like basketball. I understand that the Lobos and Aggies, for example, can't even really practice together as a team unit completely as a unit right now. So I'm wondering if you're considering any changes for high school, for college athletes when it comes to those contact sports and practicing in larger groups. Thank you.
So, one thing that maybe I haven't done as effectively today that we try to do in every press conference is, and I really appreciate the framing, Chris, which is we want as many normal, activities, particularly that meet the physical and emotional well-being of New Mexicans, and particularly our adolescents, in as many ways as we can. So we engage routinely with every stakeholder, every group imaginable, because we need their input and their partnership and support to introduce risk safely. So we do that all of the time, and I want New Mexicans to feel like we aren't just stopping or stalling. That's the whole phasing in and really looking at the data. So the easy answer is yes, we look at all of it, and we want to do as much as we can. Again, premature to say that we're ready to do contact sports, particularly for high school. And I'll tell you why. And I'm expecting a question about this, so I hope I don't steal someone's thunder. But as we're seeing successful COVID-safe practices, both for college sports around the country and for professional sports, it's because they have a really strict set of COVID-safe practices, including significant testing, rapid point-of-care testing, so you know immediately if someone has COVID, so they're not allowed to practice, and you are very clear about social contracts. You got to be in a pod, you can't go anywhere, you can't do anything, and they can really hold you accountable because you're living at that university or you're a part of a professional team. That's a much harder environment. I can tell you that we don't have the bandwidth to provide point-of-care rapid testing to every single youth sports or high school team in the state. No state does. We're no different. We're focused on nursing homes and making sure healthcare workers, and there are some collegiate and professional teams who have access and have done their own work to get that rapid testing or point-of-care testing available to their players. That's the problem. So you can't introduce the same high-level, strict COVID-safe practices that you can in college sports. My goal is to get there. It is painful that we have our young people who are talented and anxious and exhausted by the restrictions. But we got to do it right. We have to see what the next week or two brings us, but I've got my fingers crossed. It's like the indoor dining issue, and I know that that's a real hard one for all of us to get our arms around because indoor dining, particularly as it gets cold, that's our only option. But you have to take your mask off, and it's higher risk and duration. Well, the same with the contact sport. You're touching each other, even with masks, and you're touching the same ball. And so it's more complicated. But my goal is to get there. That should be every New Mexican's goal. So I'm going to end with this. How do we get there? We crush COVID right back. We push it right back so that we give ourselves a little more opportunity. And I also want folks to be reminded. In fact, I think these are good reminders, Chris. I know this is long, but look, 34 of the deaths in New Mexico have been individuals 18 to 30. 18 to 30. You know how many high school students are 18? I think that what this country has done a poor job at is really talking about the risks. One case, one person gets really sick, one person may not ever fully recover. You might have an 18-year-old with severe lifelong lung damage, potentially even cardiac damage. We're learning. God forbid we would lose someone. It is not safe. Nobody wants COVID. It is our job as New Mexicans to be smart and to use the science to make the next set of decisions. So I'm going to guess that's not what some of the high schools and students want to hear, but it's too early, but I'm hopeful. And the better that we do, the less prevalent the virus is, then the safer our high schoolers and mid-schoolers are in some of these contact sports. Next question.
Thank you, Governor. Next, I'll go to Joy Wang with KOB4. Joy, you are unmuted. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Governor. So yesterday, there were arguments made about your public health order saying it was unconstitutional in federal court because of the differing capacity limits on private schools versus public schools. Can you explain, even though you briefly talked about before about, you know, the state having some sort of control over what's happening with public schools, but why you believe it's fair to treat private schools like a business with smaller capacities at 25%, while public schools are allowed to operate at 50%.
Thank you for that question. And so yes, a fact finder, a judge is going to make a decision. That decision has not been made, but arguments were presented in court yesterday. The state's position is, frankly, if we're going to treat private schools like public schools, then mid-schoolers and high schoolers can't go to private school. That in counties with a positivity rate above 5%, you cannot go to school in those counties at all. And also, if you want to be treated like public education, it has to be a hybrid model, which means you can't go every day like you currently can in private school. And you can't use every space available to you. It has to be the classroom. So our presentation to federal court was, if we're going to treat, in the case in question, the same as a public school, that student wouldn't be eligible for in-person learning at all. So it's a much higher threshold that we require public schools. The business designation was to create what we believe are productive public health COVID safe practices and allowing, frankly, more flexibility in the private school space. We'll see if the federal judge agrees with us. I don't know whether they will or they won't. I realize that none of this is easy. And so, you know, I don't get angry or blame people or get disappointed. People are challenging all across the country many of these decisions because they're hard. But that was our presentation, and that's our position in the public health order. And again, we'll have to wait and see what the decision is. Next question.
Thank you, Governor. Next, I'll go to Dan Boyd with the Albuquerque Journal. Dan, you are unmuted. Go right ahead.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Good afternoon, Governor and Madam Secretary. Wanted to ask about the travel quarantine order. Yesterday, Colorado was among a few states that were added kind of to the high-risk designation. And that means now that all New Mexico's neighboring states are on that high-risk kind of categorization. Wanted to see if you foresaw any changes on the horizon to that travel quarantine order and kind of given the impacts it's had on the hospitality and kind of tourism industries.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. There's no question that as the United States, again, loses control of managing COVID-19, and we're seeing a resurgence in European countries, right? You have to be vigilant all of the time, because the only tools we have are social distancing, mask wearing, and isolation. I mean, those are the mechanisms until there's a vaccine. So there's no question it's Colorado, and I know that you were focused on neighboring states, who we appreciate, see the benefit and quality of staying and visiting New Mexico, because this is the most beautiful state of all of our neighboring states and has the most to offer. So it's harsh, and we realize that. I'm hoping that more New Mexicans are interested in staycations and supporting safely our hospitality industry. And so Oregon and Rhode Island were added to the list of they wouldn't meet the positivity rates in order to engage in travel and not have to quarantine here. So I have no doubt it will have an impact. And I have no doubt, particularly for folks from Colorado who are, and we appreciate that in a non-pandemic, those visits. I'm hopeful that Colorado and these other states will provide their constituents the same messaging as New Mexico. And that is, I need more mask wearing. I know that folks get challenged by this in often a negative way, and that's not my intent. I started this months ago with altercations are unacceptable, bullying is unacceptable, that positive reminders and peer pressures, leading by example, that's the best way to enforce these mandates, because no better enforcers than a positive, kind word about mask wearing. I do need businesses to help us enforce, and they are, in large part. Our businesses are really working because they know they can't stay open without it. But the message has to be clear across this country. If we don't have 80 plus, really, we need 90% plus mask wearing. And if we don't have that, and if we don't have people trying to limit where they're going and their group sizes, this will continue to happen. And when that happens, it means that a whole sector doesn't get relief from our COVID-safe public health order restrictions. And it means that some states have to roll back, and they will. And it isn't what any of us want. So I hope the message is to Colorado, hurry up and get your positivity rates down, your rate of infections down, get back into the green zone. And the same message is true in New Mexico. We can improve our mask wearing. Some advice to our younger folks. Nearly 20% over a 2-week period of our 20 to 39-year-olds, that's the percentage of COVID-19 cases. Way too high for a younger population. We really need people to think about what they're doing as they're out and about and whether they need to be out and about. Let's crush it again, New Mexico. I'm counting on you. Next question.
Thank you, Governor. Next, I'll go to Brandon Evans with KOAT. Brandon, you are unmuted. Go right ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. 2 quick things. The first was, can you talk a little bit more about the rapid response uptick that we've seen, why you think it's happening, and what it means as far as taxing our resources, as well as what it means for further reopenings? And then the second one was just something real quick. Have you guys started the 5% surveillance testing on schools? I wasn't sure if I missed something about that. Thank you.
I'll do the latter question first. We did not talk earlier, so you didn't miss anything about rapid testing in schools. Yes, that 5%, and I will provide you exactly where we started. I didn't look that up. I apologize before I came into the press conference. But this surveillance testing is critical. It's one of the reasons we've been so successful at not having a significant infection rate issues in childcare and our CYFD programs, and we are proud of that, and it's taken incredible leadership. Another shout out to both CYFD and Early Childhood Education Department and Care Department, and our, frankly, our frontline workers, our childcare workers in New Mexico are nothing short of fantastic. They should be training COVID safe practices in our surrounding states and all across the country. They're amazing. Remember to thank your childcare worker. Amazing. We know that the surveillance testing works. So I'll tell you where we've been, where we're going, and make sure you've got access to the information. And your first question is, what do we know about rapid responses? Well, we showed you that we had a tripling in the number of restaurants and in retail spaces in particular. What we know is that it immediately, there's a correlation. When we have an uptick in cases, we know our positivity rate goes up. If people are still going out and, in fact, increasing their activities, this is a very bad marriage, and we can see it play out in any number of ways, and it's one of the reasons we collect and report data about when we have a positive case that we know about, because it comes to the Department of Health, we know about the employer, often to the credit of employers, they call us and ask us to come out and do testing, review their COVID safe practices, and to make sure their sanitation efforts are sound. Most of them close for 24 hours until we can do all of that. Essential businesses try not to completely close, and then we figure out the best COVID safe environments to make sure we're not spreading COVID. We suspect this is the first, opening up the public health order for additional stuff, expanding capacity, churches and restaurants. Again, this is not me picking on any industry. If I'm picking on anything, COVID is a problem. We can't be fatigued. We never get a rest from COVID. We cannot be COVID fatigued. We just have to stay at it. Those indicators, and I think a holiday weekend, we still get calls into our complaint center. Backyard weddings, 100 people. Backyard weddings, 50 people. Indoor volleyball, 200 people. Okay, these are outside of the required public health orders. People, if you're going to those, you are violating the public health order and you're creating these exposures, and it's unfair to everyone else in New Mexico. And the reality is the possibility that someone who didn't go to that wedding or barbecue or picnic or celebration of life or cornhole tournament dies because they were exposed to somebody who did go, that can happen. Look no further than some of the super spreader events around the country. I mean, it's unacceptable. But we believe that it's that increased activity. So visitors were coming, opened up hospitality a bit, and we're hoping that because we don't have a holiday weekend and people are settling into their routines, and that this press conference will serve as a reminder that we all need better mask wearing statewide and social distancing. We can go right back where we were, and then we can take a little more risk, and then we will get a bump, and we'll flatten it and get a bump. But we expect that we're seeing the end results of largely Labor Day weekend and really good weather in New Mexico, which is encouraging people to do things that they really need to refrain. Groups of more than 10 are a violation of the current public health order. Next question.
Thank you, Governor. This will be our last question from Morgan Lee with the AP. Morgan, you're unmuted. Go right ahead.
Hello, Governor, Madam Secretary. First, I have a question for the Secretary of State. I know that there's some new security procedures or requirements this year for absentee ballots in terms of signing the outer envelope, putting on the last 4 digits of your Social Security number. Can you talk about any potential delays linked to that? And then you also mentioned, the chance that ballot counting goes into day 2, but isn't there a chance that it takes longer than that? Around the country, people are talking about, taking even more time than that. And you just mentioned, about 250,000 requests for ballots. And then, Governor, if you would, I wonder if you can comment on whether you're satisfied with your nominees to the state Supreme Court, the two who are up for election, and what you're looking for in your next appointment that's coming up soon with the departure of Justice Nakamura. And if you would, in a nutshell, why should the governor of the state have the power to appoint the PRC, the utility regulators? Another question that's going to be on the ballot. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Morgan. I'll take the stab at the first question. So there has been a change, as you pointed out, courtesy of the Senate Bill 4 that was passed this summer during the special legislative session addressing election procedures for this November general election. And actually what the legislation did was it, instead of requiring 9 individual pieces of information on the outer envelope, some of which were not really germane to a county clerk or an absentee board being able to identify whether that ballot came from the right voter. We narrowed that down to 2 pieces of information that only the voter has and the county clerk has in order to qualify that ballot, and that is, as you mentioned, Morgan, the signature of the voter and the last 4 digits of the Social Security number. So absentee boards are actually going to have less information, but more important information to be able to verify. At this point in time, we do not anticipate that particular change to affect any additional time in the processing of absentee ballots. We've developed a process working together with the county clerks to enable them to do that in an efficient manner. But I think importantly, what else we built into the legislation was some extra time for county clerks to be able to begin processing absentee ballots on the front end of the election. So, for example, we have now up to 7 days in advance of an election for counties that mail out 15,000 ballots or more to be able to begin that process of qualifying and sorting and opening envelopes and stacking up ballots and getting ready for them to be counted. Counties that haven't mailed out that many can start up to 5 days beforehand, and every county that I've spoken to is preparing to use as much time on the front end as possible to begin qualifying and counting their absentee ballots. They are, in some cases, doubling and tripling the size of their absentee precinct boards. Here in Santa Fe County, for example, the county clerk is moving her entire operation into the Santa Fe Convention Center so that she can have an absentee board almost 4 times the size that it was during the primary, and they can be adequately socially distanced in order to begin that process. So the short answer is that actually we are hoping that this additional time is going to give our clerks the leg up that they need to be able to get through the vast majority of those absentee ballots on election night. Now, with that being said, there's plans and then there's what actually happens. And so to your point, yes, I can absolutely envision many absentee ballots outstanding on election day. It's going to come down to a couple of factors. The first is, of course, how much county clerks are able to get done in advance of election day. And the second is going to be on the voters. And for those of us, myself included, that will be voting absentee in this election, getting your ballot back timely is really important to being able to give your county clerk the opportunity to get that process started early. If more than half the absentee ballots come back on election day, then we probably are going to be into a multi-day after the election process, getting those initial counts tallied. So I think by and large, barring any really unforeseen unusual behavior like that, we will have the majority of the absentee results tabulated and posted on election night. And there will be some ongoing counting no matter what happens the day after the election. The question will be whether there are any particularly close races in which that gap between the outcome and the absentee ballots remaining to be counted makes a difference. So I hope that answered your questions, Morgan.
All right. Thank you. So I've had the opportunity to select and appoint many judges, including Supreme Court justices. And for New Mexicans who may not be aware, New Mexico's got a really incredible process. One is for judicial appointments, there's a judicial nominating commission. So judicial applicants who are interested in an appointment for a vacancy have to go before the Judicial Nominating Commission. That commission's made up of lawyers and consumers advocates, and there's an appointment process there for each area that a Judicial Nominating Commission would cover. So when a governor, myself included, gets individuals who both are seeking an appointment, they have to get through the nominating process, which means there is a group who reviews those applications and makes sure that they are qualified and ready to do that work. So I get a, like all governors, I get a leg up in that regard. So the folks who come before me for appointment, I know are qualified and have exemplary records and have gotten through a difficult selection and screening process. Two, here's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for individuals who can fairly and objectively administer the law, and to do that in an impartial manner, and also recognize that they have an obligation. One thing that was important to me in many of those, if not frankly all of those interviews, is their ability to be collegiate, to represent professionalism on the bench, and to work with as many of their colleagues as possible so that we were moving our dockets successfully along and meeting the needs of New Mexicans who are before the court. And yes, I am satisfied that all of our appointments, including the justices, are doing just that. The Public Regulatory Commission is another group that is responsible for regulating all public utilities and private utilities, and in fact transportation is another area in which the PRC has the authority and required to regulate. I'm supportive of a ballot initiative, so voters will get the chance to shift from a purely elected process to an appointed process, utilizing exactly what I described, a little bit different, but that process, if you will, that the purpose of having a judicial selection commission is to make sure that you have qualified lawyers. That means if you're going to be a lawyer on the Supreme Court, you probably should have had at least one case right before another judge that you're actually practicing law. And I'll make myself as an example. As someone with a law degree and not too long ago had an active license, I don't know that I could get through, I shouldn't get through, a judicial selection commission because I wasn't practicing law. And that would make me not experienced enough to be a judge. The purpose of having an appointed public regulatory commission is having regulators that you have to be, that have that experience. So the state structure would have requirements that you would have to meet in order to be eligible. So in the same way we use public health experts and medical experts, scientific experts on our medical advisory team and modeling to help shape the decisions that I make related to COVID-19. New Mexicans should expect that we would use the same requirements and standards for regulators who have a very important job by making sure that consumers and ratepayers are being protected and that they're clear about what's required by those companies. So that's why I think that's a productive change, and it remains in the hands of the voters. So we'll see what happens at the end of this election. Thank you for that question, and I want to thank every New Mexican who has joined us again today. So the news isn't as good as I want it, right, because we're seeing an uptick, but I'm very optimistic still because we're seeing good behaviors and we have really excellent partners. So I want to end with this. Do not let COVID fatigue prevent you from doing what you know is right. Stay home as often as you can. Always wear your mask, socially distance. For businesses that are finding that it's difficult in your communities, reach out to us. Maybe there are things we can do. New Mexicans, get tested. The more I know about where we have a potential issue or an outbreak, the better we are at responding, managing it immediately, getting folks to self-isolate, and taking care of it at the source before it becomes a problem in the state. This is how we then at the appropriate time add a little more risk, do more in education. I'm hoping, right, add a little more risk, add more to education. And again, in the fall, I'm really hoping that or early winter that we'll have more news about a credible vaccine. Remember that New Mexico is going to be a state. We announced this last week. We're going to trust that we've got a credible vaccine, but we're going to verify that using our medical advisory team and our expertise with our scientific community partners. So I feel good about that. And last, New Mexico, we're doing really well with getting flu vaccine. We're about 30% more this year than last at the same time, have already gotten the flu vaccine. Our big push is in October. Let's crush flu. Let's keep our masks on, let's get our flu vaccines, and let's make sure that we don't have any issues with any viruses as we move into the winter months. Thank you very much for tuning in. Be safe today, tomorrow, and the weekend, and I'll see you next week.